Wendy, welcome to the Sipping Point.
Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to see you again. It's just, only been a few weeks
Yes.
since we were in Bordeaux. So,
I
great.
know it's not the same as being with you in Bordeaux. And we spent a fabulous week in June with you touring some grand estates in all of the regions of Bordeaux. And I know that I was only there for a short time, but you've been in Bordeaux and that area for decades. But what is it that you find is so special about the region of Bordeaux versus any other wine region in France?
What is so special? I think for me, what is so special is the people. I think the people are really fascinating. I suppose any winemaker really is interesting because they've got their feet in the ground, but then they've got this wonderful product on the table and they've got history and they've got all these wonderful things that come together. But I think what is so special for me in Bordeaux is that it's so big and so diverse and can be a little bit intimidating. But when you take the trouble to go a little bit further, the people are so welcoming and so warm that it kind of dispels this slightly impressive aura that the place has. So I think that's what makes it very special.
I agree. As Americans, we worry a little bit how we're going to be received when we go overseas. But I was so impressed at how, even from Paris to Bordeaux or everywhere I went, how friendly everyone was. And that was certainly definitely the case in Bordeaux. And I'm sure it helped that we had you with us, but people were fabulous. Now, I had the pleasure of going over to Bordeaux in 2006, but this is the most recent time. So that's a 20-year span between when I went. What do you find is different about Bordeaux versus when I visited in 2006?
I think the place is much more accessible than it was. There's very much an open door policy now that there wasn't necessarily before. And that's across the board from the very top to, the small sort of mom and pop producers. So I think that notion of accessibility. Also think the divide perhaps between the very prestigious wines and the very expensive wines and the smaller, more entry level wines has grown bigger than it perhaps did 20 years ago. But what I do think is you will struggle to find bad wine in Bordeaux now. The quality level has come up from the bottom up. And as much as the top wines are becoming a little bit more accessible, the average level of quality of Bordeaux is just extraordinary now. You have to try quite hard to get a bad wine.
I love that. And one of the things that also struck me being over there, this time versus 20 years ago, was all of the innovation and some of the technology that these estates are leveraging to really, keep that quality level high. So what are the things that you think are most exciting that people have implemented or are working on implementing right now that give you a lot of excitement for Bordeaux going forward?
Well, I think what is extraordinary about Bordeaux is we have this amazing university at the heart of Bordeaux that does loads and loads of research and development. And we have this system of wine consultants that kind of spreads the knowledge out across the whole of the region. So what is happening in the Grand Cru Classés is also happening in the smaller properties. So I think there's a spreading of that knowledge. It's really, really accessible. And I also think what we're seeing is an increase in sustainability. I think that's across the wine world in general. It's not only Bordeaux, but Bordeaux isn't necessarily associated with that. 75% of Bordeaux properties now have some kind of certification, not necessarily organic. It might be sustainable. It might be biodynamic. There's all sorts of stuff going on. And a lot of the others choose not to be certified for various regions. But I would say that notion of technical know-how being spread across the board and this engagement with sustainability. And then, as we said earlier, that notion of being open to the public and explaining and sharing these stories, I think is...
Yes. And I think at each property, we had very engaging hosts and fun and, interesting. And so you didn't feel like, you couldn't ask a question or it would be silly. You didn't feel like you had to be all buttoned up. So I really appreciated that. And I think each of the wineries had really fun, interesting people that we could interact with that, could easily tell us about those innovations in a way that everyone, even if they aren't wine geeks like us, could understand. One of the things I think that really stood out to me, two things, and you can elaborate maybe, the hail cannon at Gruau La Rose was something I had never heard of before. And if I understand correctly, is it air pulses that keep the hail from falling on the vineyard? Is that how it works?
It sends up these pulses up into the air that break the clouds up. So it stops the clouds from forming. And so it stops the hail from, the water from going up and down, which is what makes the hailstones form. I know, and it goes boom.
Fascinating. That's awesome. And then also at Canterbury, they spoke about, instead of punch downs, which, is with red wine production where you're kind of getting the grape skins and the wine to circulate, they had an automatic air. I almost think they might have called it air pulse that does this. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, what that does is it pushes the air through the cap. So it breaks the cap up and it allows the cap to come back into circulation. And the theory is it's less aggressive, so you get a much smoother, rounder expression of the tannins than you would by sort of physically moving the cap. So it's, and I think this comes back to something you were saying earlier about this change in Bordeaux. The wines that we're seeing out of Bordeaux at the moment are much more fruit forward and much less tannic than they were. And that might be tannic through the use of oak. So there's less new oak being used now than there perhaps was when you first came. And also this much more gentle extraction of the tannins that we're seeing, as well as the ripe berries, but that's a different story. But so I think that's part of that move towards these fruit-driven, very round, very smooth wines that are more accessible early, because another a priori people have about Bordeaux is you've got to stick it in the cellar and forget about it for 20 years, which we know is not the case. So that's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, not a lot of people have patience for that. But you wrote a book called The Drinking Woman's Diet, subtitled A Liver-Friendly Lifestyle Guide. And I obviously have that here. I got one from you. But tell us a little bit about what inspired you. Obviously, you are a woman and you are a wine drinker, but what inspired you to write this book?
Well, there were two things. I think the first thing that inspired me is welcoming groups like yours. When people come around Bordeaux, we do a lot of eating and we do a lot of tasting. And one of the ladies on one of the groups said to me, "How do you manage to stay healthy when you do this all the time?" And so I said, "Well, I don't do it all the time, but so I do this and I do that." And then she said to me, "We should write this down and give it to people before they start their wine tour so they know what they're doing." So that was kind of the trigger. And one thing led to another. But really, I think the other people that have inspired me are these fabulous women in the Bordeaux wine industry. And again, it's another a priori. It has this, Bordeaux perhaps has this image of being a bit of an old man's club. This sort of very, very reserved, very old-fashioned place. And as you've seen, it absolutely is not. And there are so many fabulous women. And of course, being French, they're all terribly elegant and very sophisticated. And so they were very much as well an inspiration, because I'm looking at these fabulous women saying, well, these girls drink wine for a living. And if they can look like that and be healthy and vibrant while they're drinking wine all day, there must be something there. There must be a secret. So that was kind of the inspiration to find out what the secret was.
So tell me a little bit about, where's the first place to start? If you are a wine lover and you want to also have this healthy lifestyle, where's the first thing we should start on that you outlined in the book?
Well, I think coming back to what you do, I think part of it is understanding a little bit about wine and what wine you enjoy and learning to pay attention to what's in the glass. I think that's probably a really good place to start, because then when you're drinking, you're paying attention, you're smelling it, you're looking at it, you're tasting it, and it slows the process down. So rather than just knocking back a glass of wine, you're actually paying attention to what you have in the glass. And I think that's a really, really good place to start, because when you're paying attention, you're not going to drink rubbish. You're going to want to drink something delicious, and you start to learn what you like. So you take time with it. So for me, that's a really good starting point. You don't have to get intellectual about it. You just have to pay attention to what's in the glass. And then, we know that we shouldn't drink too much. So if you're not going to drink too much, drink something delicious. That would be a good starting place, right? And then I think one of the other things, which is a very, very French thing, is food with wine and wine with food. Because we know that as women, we do have physiological differences that mean that we react differently with alcohol. So our tolerance level, as a rule, tends to be less than men. But if you eat food with your wine, or if you drink wine with your food, you slow down the speed at which you absorb alcohol. it's much more delicious. I mean, food always tastes better with wine. You're increasing the pleasure, but also you are slowing down the rate at which you're absorbing alcohol. So for me, those are two good places to start. And then the classic one, of course, is make sure you have a glass of water occasionally while you're
Yes. Yes.
important.
Absolutely. And I know one of the things you talked about is wine glasses. And, instead of putting it, sometimes if it's an everyday wine, I might just do a stemless glass and it might not even be that nice of a glass. But I have started going back to always using my good wine glasses because it just tastes different. It feels different. And it's not so easy to just glug,
Keep
glug,
going.
glug, I guess is
And
the
listen,
thing.
I'm English, and tea, for me, an English woman drinking tea tastes better out of China, and wine tastes better out of a decent glass. There's definitely something to that. Pour size is so important. I mean, you're a wine taster, you want to be able to swirl it around in the glass, but pour size
Right.
is really important too. And especially if you're not sure about what you're drinking, don't let somebody pour you a great big glass of something before you've even tasted it, because you don't want finish it if you don't like it. Or you might want to try 3 wines with dinner. So you don't necessarily want 3 enormous glasses. So pour size, glass size, pour size makes a
Yeah,
difference.
and I agree. I think on the tour, each day we would visit 2, sometimes 3 wineries, and we were tasting several at each, but
Sure.
they were small portions, and it always felt like, to me, the right amount. And you don't
Mm.
have to finish it, it's not the dry cup club here, so we don't have to drink everything that's poured for you. But the minute you kind of stop really paying attention, like you said, and
Mm.
being mindful, I think that's something or wineful about the wine when it moves from the tasting to the drinking, and you can kind of, if you pay attention, you'll see when that happens. That's when I think it, obviously that's where you get into the danger zone, because then everything tastes great and a big glass looks fabulous.
Well, and I think I always say don't be afraid when you're visiting a vineyard, don't be afraid to spit. People are worried about offending, especially when you're tasting with the winemaker. But you watch the winemakers, how much they drink and how much they sip. They pay attention. I mean,
Hmm.
day, right? So they have to. But I think
Yes.
that notion of if I don't like what's in my glass, I don't have to finish it. It's fine. I can move on and I can try something else. And I think that's give yourself permission to do that. And also, I think people give big serves because they don't want to be seen as being stingy. You can always ask for another serve.
That's true. Well, you wrote this book a few years ago, and the whole conversation around wine and wellness has really changed a little bit. What would you add in, maybe, or modify now if you were doing an updated edition of the book?
I think one of the big things I would talk about is this move away from wellness to well-being, because I think it's too easy for the wine world to battle against the wellness world. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think we've got so many wellness influencers and what have you, and they're all anti-alcohol. And this notion that wine is full of sugar, which we know is not true. So that would be one thing to insist. But this well-being, this idea that wine is a product to be shared. It's a social product, around a table with friends, a glass of wine and some food. That is part of well-being for me. So I think it's a social product as well as a sort of food product. So that probably
Mm.
would be one thing. And I would shy away from saying red wine is good for you, because there was this whole thing about being good for your heart, and it may well be in something. But for me, wine is not a health food. It is a beautiful, delicious product that if you drink it properly and responsibly isn't bad for you. So I
Okay.
think it's getting away from this black and white. It's good, it's bad. I think it's part of a healthy lifestyle if you drink responsibly and sensibly and pay attention. So I think the wine industry is suffering for all sorts of reasons. But one of the reasons is this fear mongering around wine. When we look at wine as a historic product, when we look at the people who've been drinking wine sensibly for so long, I don't think there's any reason to fear it or to feel guilty. Women are really good about feeling guilty about just about everything. So,
Aren't we?
so I think, removing the guilt and moving from this wellness argument into this well-being, I think is what what I would say is has probably changed in how I would talk about it now.
Love that. And a question just popped into my head right here because I've talked to American winemakers about this as well. I really wish, and not everybody agrees with me, that we had nutrition labeling on the wine itself. And here's why. I know in France, you have very strict rules about whether sugar can be added, which usually it is not allowed. But here in the US, you could have a Pinot Noir, and there are some on the market that actually have residual sugar and are kind of sweet.
Yeah.
And so I think it's hard for someone to know when they pick up a bottle, how many calories is this going to be? Does this have sugar? Does this not have sugar? Does it have added powdered tannins, fake acids? In the US, there's 200 different things that are supposedly still natural that can be added to the wine. I know it's not that the case in France, but what do you think about that idea of labeling? Because I think it would out the people that are not doing it the right way very quickly.
I couldn't agree more. Well, in Europe now, it's obligatory. You have to have a QR code or an ingredients code that you can flash on. So if you buy a bottle of European wine, I think since the last couple of vintages, you have to legally say there has to be ingredient information on the label. And because it's usually not a lot. Most wines, it's basically grape juice and sulfites. Boom, job done.
Yeah.
Coming out of Europe. But you will see QR codes and information links on all labels legally now coming out of Europe that you have to have. And people are amazed. So you can get rid of that scaremongering straight away because that's exactly what it will say. Grape juice, sulfites. That's it. So you can tell the people that are making the wines naturally and who aren't.
That's great. Well, I know another thing you're passionate about is pairing yoga with wine. And I know a lot of people might not even think about those two things going together, but you actually believe in it and you do some wellness retreats that combine those two things. So tell me a little bit about yoga and wine and how you pull that off.
Yeah, it's a bit of fun, but there is some sort of logic behind it. So I'm a yoga teacher as well as being a wine educator. And it's a really good excuse to bring those two passions together. I think what interested me in particular, for me, yoga is a really accessible way of exercising and getting some healthy movement into your life. We know that is part of a healthy lifestyle. If we want wine to be part of our healthy lifestyle, the rest of it has to be healthy too. But there are certain movements in yoga that are really good for massaging the organs and massaging the liver. And we want to keep our liver healthy if we want to carry on enjoying our glasses of wine. There is there is a logic behind it. I mean, it's about being healthy. It's about balance. It's about breathing. I have a girlfriend who's also a wine educator and yoga teacher, and she does these breathing classes and is convinced that if you improve your use of your breath, you will improve your tasting skills as well. So there's something in that. But for me, it's really this notion of movement, and anything that twists and moves from side to side massages the liver and keeps the liver stimulated. So it really does help. It really does help for me keeping your liver healthy, which we know is so important.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Is there anything else from the book? Of course, people, I assume, can go to Amazon or any other online retailers to check out The Drinking Woman's Diet.
Yes, on Amazon, and it's just about everywhere. I think the notion of moderation is important, but I think also what is really important is that it starts with an explanation of how we digest alcohol and why women are different to men as far as we digest alcohol. And I really believe it's a little bit like a little bit of wine knowledge goes a long way. A little bit more of an understanding about how your body works helps you to work with your body. So we know there are certain foods that help the liver. There are certain foods that do not help the liver. There are other things that we can do that can stimulate the liver or can slow it down. So I think understanding what wine is, how it works, and how your body reacts to it, a little bit of knowledge, as I say, is a powerful thing, and it helps us understand. And then the other thing I would think as well, one of the issues I have occasionally with wine and its image of wine is people reaching for a glass of wine as an emergency button. So using wine as a de-stressor, and it is, and it does, and it works that way. But I think part of it as well is creating a certain awareness around when and why and how you're drinking. I think that's quite important. So it's less of a reaction and more of a choice. Say there's nothing wrong with reaching for a glass of wine occasionally. But I do think this, this mindfulness tasting, it's also mindfulness is thinking about why and when and how we're reaching for a glass of wine.
That's great. And just curious, and I know we both are not medical doctors, so we'll just preface everything with that. What would you consider moderation? And how do people work that in? Some people will say, oh, 1 glass a day or 2 glasses a day, but it really depends on the size of the glass because, people pour far more than they think they're pouring. Is it if you open a bottle, it lasts for 3 days, or how do you kind of wrap your brain around that?
Yeah, well, Coravan is your friend, I think, when it comes to this. But
Yes.
If you look at the recommended units, it's quite easy to work out. And there's some things in the book and on my website too. You'll find, it's easy to find recommended units. It's not difficult. It is less for women than for men, mainly because we're smaller, but also because we have less water in our bodies. So there's less water in our bodies to dilute the wine, so that the alcohol. So that's one of the reasons. Coming back to that, drinking a glass of water again. Personally, I try and stick to 2 glasses of wine a day, and I try and stick to 2 days off a week. That's just what works.
Okay.
And I don't always stick to it. You've been on a wine tour with me, so my secret. But I think you work out what works for you, how you feel. Pay attention to how you feel. But I really do think we know what moderation is. We know what the limits should be. But as you say, everybody is different. So start paying attention. It comes back to that same thing. Pay attention. Be good to yourself.
That's great. That's an easy way to think of it. 2 glasses, 2 days off. I love that. That's a nice little rule you have there. Yeah. So, obviously we've all been seeing reports of the fires. Can you just give us an update? We all see the pictures and we kind of think it's right there in wine country, but I know it's not necessarily. What's the update? Where does it stand?
Well, all the fires are under control now, which is really good news. It was absolutely shocking and terrifying. I think it's 220 odd thousand people were evacuated, but it was to the west of Bordeaux. So it was close to the ocean. It was closer to the ocean. There, I can't remember off the top of my head how many thousands of hectares have been destroyed, but it's enormous. It got within 15 kilometers of Bordeaux, the city of Bordeaux. And there was a day or two when they were talking about evacuating the city, and that doesn't bear thinking about. The smoke blew over, but I'm confident in saying there is no smoke taint because it didn't hang around for long enough and it blew over. The winds changed. One of the reasons why it fanned the flames so badly was the winds kept changing. So it didn't have time to damage the vineyards at all. So as far as I'm aware, there's absolutely no smoke taint at all. However, it's terrifying. It was terrifying, but what is interesting is it is an illustration of this climate change that we are seeing in Bordeaux. And coming back to what I was saying earlier about the sustainability, there's been so much going on in the vineyards in Bordeaux in sustainability, in changing the way we prune our vines, the trellis management, agroforestry, increasing the greenery in and amongst the vines, the hedgerows, etc., to try and create a cooler microclimate. So I think it really brings into focus this issue that we have. And this year, they're already harvesting the white wines, the dry white wines in Bordeaux.
Wow.
Friends of mine in the Grave were harvesting last week. They started harvesting their Sauvignon Blanc last week. So it's the earliest on record. So I think it's symptomatic of these climate challenges that we're seeing, this sort of climate chaos that we're seeing. But fortunately, no damage to the vineyards, shocking damage to the forest. And as we know, the forest is makes up part of the microclimate and the environment that we have in the region. So yeah, a lot of questions about how we're going to control that in the future. But fortunately, no damage to the vineyards.
That's great. And speaking of future, that was the perfect segue. I know with climate change, with consumer, habits changing, I know everyone's talking about that over here in wine country. Are people really drinking less, or are they drinking better? Are the younger ones not drinking because they don't like wine, or are they just not drinking because it's too expensive? There's all of those questions. But given all of that you are probably living through as well in Bordeaux, what gives you hope for the whole Bordeaux wine industry going into the future? I know you've talked a little bit about sustainability, but are there other things that you see? Because, if you read all these articles, you could kind of go down a doom and gloom rabbit hole.
But you met some of these wonderful people, and I came back to what we started with. What's so fabulous about Bordeaux is the people, and they are super dynamic. They're really innovative. They're experimenting constantly. Yes, with the styles of wines that they're producing. As I said, we're tending to go towards, as a rule, more fruit forward wines and less tannic and structured wines. I think that's a move across the world. It's not unique to Bordeaux. So it does illustrate that people are looking for fresher wines. I find this whole thing about young people not drinking quite interesting. I also think, me as a baby boomer, it's a little bit our fault because we're drinking a little bit less now, but that's a whole other, a chapter, other reason.
Right. And I'm Gen X, and nobody cares about us. We're drinking a fair amount of wine. Like, give us some credit.
Please do. We need people like you out there supporting the industry. I think, but what I find really, really exciting is when you meet these winemakers and you go to the vineyards or you taste their wines, look on their websites, see what they're doing. There's an experimentation. In Bordeaux, we're seeing sort of Vin de France popping up left, right, and center. So they're trying new hybrid grape varieties. They're trying new methods of fermenting. You're going to see more aging, not in oak, but in clay, in amphora, or in concrete eggs, or there's constant experimentation looking to produce wines, a diversity of wines. Bordeaux's always been diverse. It's huge. There's so many different styles of wines coming out of Bordeaux already. We tend to think about the big reds, but there's much more to it than that. There's been a growth in rosé coming out of Bordeaux. There's been a growth in sparkling wine. Not many people know that we have a Crémant de Bordeaux. So that has been growing. And then these more fruit forward red wines too. So constant experimentation and linking it to sustainability. And I think these are the two big messages. And there's optimism and of the winemakers constantly trying and then getting people into the vineyard so they can really see what's going on and the stories behind the product. But yeah, innovation, constantly innovating.
Love that. And I just want to echo what you're saying. Obviously there are some legendary, amazing red wines that everyone sort of associates with Bordeaux, but there is every style of wine. I had some fabulous Cremant bubblies while I was there. I love the Bordeaux white wines, and we had so many great ones. And there's obviously great and historical sweet wines at every price level that we also were, having in our dessert course in many cases. So if you think Bordeaux isn't for you because you don't like big reds, look at some of these other categories because there's so much out there. And Wendy, thank you so much for joining me. If folks want to check out your book, I know you do a great weekly newsletter and you have all other kinds of assets on your website. Where should they go to connect with you?
Insidertasting.com, probably. And there is an online version of the book too for people who prefer to sort of play around with videos and things.
All right. Thanks for joining me. And I just want to say cheers.
Good health and see you back in Bordeaux soon, I hope.